Imagine this. A secret meeting in a quiet Paris suburb. 3 nations, sworn allies, plotting a war in the shadows. Their target? Egypt. Their motive? Control of one of the most important waterways on Earth, the Suez Canal. But what happens when Israel, Britain, and France hatch a secret plan, only to be exposed by the 2 greatest superpowers of the Cold War? This is the story of Israel's secret plan to take over Egypt, the Suez Crisis. Why did Britain and France, 2 fading empires, join forces with Israel in the 1950s? What drove Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser to nationalize the Suez Canal, defying the West? And how did a secret conspiracy nearly plunge the Middle East into a full-scale war? Stay with me, because the answers will change the way you see the modern Middle East. The Second World War had just ended. Europe was in ruins. Britain and France had once ruled vast empires across Africa and the Middle East. But by 1945, their grip was slipping. The winds of independence were sweeping through Asia, Africa, and the Arab world. In Egypt, resentment against British control boiled over. British troops still occupied the Suez Canal zone, a lifeline for Europe's oil supply. But Egyptians saw them as colonial occupiers who had overstayed their welcome. Meanwhile, in Palestine, the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 triggered the First Arab-Israeli War. The war ended in an armistice, but not in peace. The Arab world rejected Israel's existence. Israel, victorious but isolated, faced constant border raids and the threat of annihilation. This fragile new Middle East was a powder keg, and in just a few years, it would explode. Enter Gamal Abdel Nasser, a young Egyptian officer, full of ambition and vision. He despised foreign domination. He dreamed of an Egypt free from British influence, and of a united Arab world. In 1952, the Free Officers movement overthrew King Farouk. 2 years later, Nasser emerged as Egypt's new leader. For ordinary Egyptians, he was a symbol of dignity and independence. For Britain and France, he was a nightmare. Nasser wanted to modernize Egypt. At the heart of his vision was the Aswan High Dam, a project that would tame the Nile, generate massive electricity, and transform Egypt's economy. But such a project needed money, and the West held the purse strings. At first, the United States and Britain promised to help finance the dam. But when Nasser bought weapons from the Soviet bloc, Washington and London turned their backs. Nasser, humiliated, turned to another idea. If Egypt could not beg for aid, it would seize it. And the key was the Suez Canal. July 26, 1956. Alexandria, Egypt. Nasser stood before a sea of supporters. His voice thundered through the microphone. He announced that Egypt was taking control of the Suez Canal Company, the artery that carried 2/3 of Europe's oil. The crowd erupted in celebration. For Egyptians, it was a declaration of independence. For Britain and France, it was an act of war. Why did the canal matter so much? For centuries, the Suez Canal had been the shortcut between Europe and Asia. Without it, ships would be forced to sail thousands of extra miles around Africa. To London and Paris, the canal wasn't just a waterway, it was the lifeblood of their fading empires. But Nasser's timing was brilliant. He nationalized the canal at the exact moment Britain and France were weak. Britain was drowning in debt after World War II. France was locked in a bloody colonial war in Algeria. And both powers feared that without control of Suez, their influence in the Middle East would collapse. So, in the palaces of London and Paris, anger turned into desperation. The leaders of Britain and France began to plot revenge. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed a partner. And that partner was Israel. 5. Israel's security fears and secret goals. By the mid-1950s, Israel was just 8 years old. Its population had doubled, swelled by Jewish immigrants from Europe and the Middle East. But the young state was under siege. From the Gaza Strip, Palestinian Fedayeen fighters launched cross-border raids. Israeli villagers near the border lived in constant fear of ambushes and bombings. In the Negev desert, landmines littered the sand. And on Israel's southern coast, the Egyptians had closed the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's lifeline to the Red Sea. To Israel, Nasser was not just a nationalist leader. He was a mortal threat. Inside Tel Aviv's military headquarters, Israeli generals debated their options. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion believed Israel could not wait for its enemies to grow stronger. It needed to strike first. But there was a problem. Israel was powerful in spirit, but small in size. Its army could fight, but it lacked modern weapons. And it could not afford to alienate the United States, Israel's only hope for long-term support. That's when an unexpected door opened. France. The French government, furious at Nasser for supporting Algerian rebels, saw Israel as a natural ally. If France and Israel could work together, both could strike at their common enemy, Egypt. And Britain, desperate to reclaim the canal, was willing to listen. A meeting of interests, each side had its own motives. For Britain, restoring its prestige and regaining control of the canal. For France, punishing Nasser and crushing anti-colonial revolts. For Israel, breaking Egypt's encirclement and opening the Straits of Tiran. It was a marriage of convenience. 3 nations, with one target. But how could they justify an invasion? They couldn't simply storm Egypt without cause. The world, and especially the United States, would never accept it. So they came up with a plan. A secret plan. Narration pause, suspense behind closed doors, in a quiet Paris suburb called Sevres, diplomats and generals gathered around a table. Maps were spread across the room. Whispers of betrayal filled the air. Here, they drafted one of the most audacious conspiracies of the Cold War. Teasing the conspiracy, the plan was simple, but daring. Israel would attack Egypt first, striking deep into the Sinai Peninsula. Then, Britain and France would issue an ultimatum. Both sides must stop fighting and withdraw from the canal. When Egypt refused, as they expected, Britain and France would intervene. On paper, they would look like peacekeepers. In reality, it was a staged drama to topple Nasser. It was called the Sevres Protocol. But if this secret was ever exposed, the consequences could be catastrophic. Because the world was no longer run by Britain and France. The true arbiters of power were the Cold War superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And neither would tolerate a reckless war in the Middle East. October 1956. In a quiet villa outside Paris, far from cameras and reporters, 3 delegations sat together. Britain, France, Israel. The room was filled with cigarette smoke, maps, and tense whispers. This was not diplomacy. This was conspiracy. Israel's envoy, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, along with Defense Minister Shimon Peres and Chief of Staff Moshe Dayan, arrived in secrecy. Facing them were French officials, eager to punish Nasser for aiding Algerian rebels. And the British, desperate to restore their imperial pride. The 3 sides signed a secret agreement, the Sevres Protocol. Its details? Chillingly precise. Israel would launch a surprise attack into the Sinai Peninsula, advancing toward the Suez Canal. Britain and France would then issue a joint ultimatum. Both Egypt and Israel must stop fighting and withdraw from the canal zone. When Nasser refused, as everyone expected, British and French forces would intervene as peacekeepers, seizing the canal under the pretense of restoring order. In truth, it was a staged play. A war scripted in advance. October 29, 1956. The plan was set into motion. Israeli paratroopers climbed aboard Dakota transport planes. The target, the Mitla Pass, deep in the Sinai Desert, a key choke point controlling access toward the canal. As the planes soared over the desert, the soldiers looked down at the endless expanse of sand. Many were young men who had known nothing but war since childhood. Some were Holocaust survivors. Others were born in the fledgling state of Israel. All of them carried the same fear, that their homeland might not survive. At precisely 5 p.m., Israeli paratroopers dropped from the skies. Their parachutes opened against the burning desert sun. The battle for Sinai had begun. The Egyptian army was caught off guard. But it was not weak. Egypt had Soviet-supplied tanks, artillery, and MiG fighter jets. And its soldiers knew the desert terrain. The fighting around the Mitla Pass was brutal. Rocks and narrow canyons turned into killing zones. Machine guns echoed through the mountains. Israeli paratroopers were pinned down, suffering heavy casualties. Meanwhile, Other Israeli units advanced across the Sinai in lightning-fast armored columns. Moshe Dayan's strategy was clear: hit hard, move fast, and reach the canal before the Egyptians could regroup. But the desert was unforgiving. Sandstorms blinded the tanks. Temperatures swung from burning heat in the day to freezing cold at night. Water was scarce, and every mile brought the risk of ambush. Yet the Israelis pushed forward. Britain and France entered the stage right on cue. As planned, Britain and France delivered their ultimatum. Both Egypt and Israel were ordered to withdraw 10 miles from the canal. If they refused, Anglo-French forces would intervene. Of course, Egypt refused. How could Nasser abandon Egyptian soil to invaders? And so, just as scripted, British and French warplanes took off. They bombed Egyptian airfields, crippling Nasser's air force. Then their paratroopers prepared to land near Port Said, at the northern entrance of the canal. To the outside world, it looked like a multinational intervention. But in reality, it was an orchestrated invasion. But here was the problem. The world of 1956 was not the world of 1916. Britain and France were no longer global superpowers. Their plan had not accounted for one thing: the fury of both Washington and Moscow. In Washington, President Dwight Eisenhower was livid. The United States had not been informed of the conspiracy. And Eisenhower, in the middle of his re-election campaign, was not about to let old colonial powers drag the Middle East into chaos. In Moscow, the Soviet Union threatened to intervene on Egypt's behalf. At the height of the Cold War, the risk of escalation was terrifying. So within days, global pressure mounted. Britain, France, and Israel found themselves isolated. Washington, November 1956. Inside the White House, President Dwight Eisenhower sat with his top advisors. The reports were clear: Britain, France, and Israel had launched a coordinated invasion of Egypt. Eisenhower was furious. Not just because the operation threatened global stability, but because America had been deliberately left in the dark. The United States had worked hard to present itself as the champion of freedom in the Cold War. Yet here, its closest allies looked like colonial aggressors. And Eisenhower knew something else: if America sided with Britain and France, it would push the Arab world directly into Moscow's arms. For Eisenhower, there was no hesitation. He would not support this war. While Washington seethed, Moscow roared. Nikita Khrushchev, the fiery Soviet premier, denounced the invasion as imperialist aggression. But he went further. He threatened to use rockets against London and Paris if the invasion did not stop. The world trembled. Just days earlier, Soviet tanks had crushed an uprising in Hungary. Now, Khrushchev hinted he might launch nuclear strikes in defense of Egypt. It was a terrifying possibility. The Suez Crisis was no longer just a regional war. It was a flashpoint that could trigger World War III. Amid this chaos, the United Nations took center stage. For the first time in history, the UN General Assembly bypassed the Security Council, where Britain and France held veto power, and called for an emergency session. Nations from Asia, Africa, and Latin America lined up against the invasion. Under intense diplomatic pressure, a resolution passed: a ceasefire must be declared. Foreign troops must withdraw from Egyptian soil. And, in a historic move, the UN would create its first-ever peacekeeping force, the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, to oversee the truce. Blue-helmeted soldiers from Canada, India, and Scandinavia soon landed in the Sinai, symbolizing a new kind of international intervention. Back in London and Paris, the crisis was unraveling. For Britain, the war had sparked political chaos. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who had dreamed of restoring Britain's imperial prestige, now faced humiliation. The pound sterling plummeted. American financial pressure cut deep. Eisenhower even threatened to sell off US reserves of British currency, a move that could destroy Britain's economy overnight. France, too, found itself cornered. Its dream of punishing Nasser and protecting the canal was slipping away. French leaders realized they could not continue without American support. By early November, both Britain and France announced a ceasefire. Their troops began to withdraw. The age of European empires was over. But Israel was not ready to give up. Its forces had swept across Gaza and much of the Sinai. For the first time, Israeli troops had reached the banks of the Suez Canal. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister, believed this was a turning point. He even declared that Israel should permanently hold onto the Sinai, arguing it was part of the biblical land of Israel. But Eisenhower's message was blunt. Withdraw, or face the full wrath of the United States. Israel resisted for weeks. But the pressure was unbearable. Without American support, Israel risked total isolation. And so, reluctantly, Israeli forces pulled back. By March 1957, they withdrew from the Sinai and Gaza, but not without one critical guarantee. In the streets of Cairo, Egyptians poured out in celebration. Though Egypt's army had been battered, politically Nasser had emerged as a hero. He had stood up to Britain, France, and Israel, and survived. His defiance made him a symbol of Arab nationalism. Throughout the Middle East, posters of Nasser appeared on walls. Young men saw him as the leader who had humiliated the old colonial powers. The Suez Canal remained in Egyptian hands. And for the first time in centuries, the West no longer controlled this vital waterway. The Suez Crisis was more than just a war. It was the death knell of European imperialism. Britain and France discovered they could no longer act as global powers without American approval. The world had changed. The United States and the Soviet Union now ruled the global stage. The Middle East had become a Cold War battleground. For Israel, the war was both a victory and a warning. Militarily, it had proved its strength. But politically, it had learned that even battlefield success meant nothing without superpower support. For Egypt and Nasser, the Suez Crisis was a moment of glory. But it also set the stage for future wars, as tensions with Israel and the West continued to grow. The Suez Crisis was more than a clash over a canal. It was a turning point in modern history. It showed the limits of empire. Britain and France had once ruled vast colonies. But in 1956, they discovered that their time as world leaders was over. From now on, they would place second to Washington and Moscow. It showed the rise of Arab nationalism. For centuries, the Middle East had been carved up by outsiders. But under Gamal Abdel Nasser, Arabs felt they finally had a voice, bold, defiant, and willing to fight. The message was clear: the age of colonial domination in the Middle East was ending. And it showed the new reality of the Cold War. Every crisis, every war, was now judged through the lens of East vs. West. The Suez was not just Egypt's fight, it was a battle that nearly pulled the superpowers into direct conflict. One man stood at the center of this new world order: Dwight Eisenhower. His decision to force Britain, France, and Israel to back down shocked many. Critics called it a betrayal of allies. But Eisenhower saw the bigger picture. By siding with Egypt, he hoped to win the trust of the Arab world and block Soviet influence. And though the US never fully achieved that goal, Eisenhower's gamble reshaped the Middle East. From then on, America, not Europe, would be the dominant Western power in the region. For Nasser, the Suez Crisis was his greatest triumph. It made him a legend across the Arab world. Even leaders from Africa and Asia admired his defiance of the old empires. But it also made him a marked man. Israel, Britain, and France would not forget the humiliation he had caused them. And in the years ahead, his leadership would be tested, in wars, in diplomacy, and in the bitter realities of regional politics. Still, in 1956, Nasser stood tall as a symbol of resistance. The man who had stared down three powerful nations, and won. For Israel, the crisis was complicated. Its soldiers had fought bravely and won stunning victories. But geopolitics forced them to retreat. It was a painful reminder that survival depended not only on strength, but on diplomacy. Yet the war gave Israel something else: a reputation. Across the world, military analysts were stunned by Israel's speed and efficiency. The small nation had proved it could stand toe-to-toe with larger foes. The lesson was clear: Israel would have to rely on quick, decisive strikes and on powerful allies to secure its future. In the end, the Suez Canal remained Egyptian. It was more than a victory for Nasser. It was a victory for the idea that nations had the right to control their own resources. The canal became a symbol of independence. For the Arab world, for Africa. And for nations emerging from colonial rule, it was proof that resistance could succeed. But the canal was also a reminder of vulnerability. Every ship that passed through carried not just cargo, but the weight of global politics. Any disruption, any war, could send shockwaves across the world economy. And so, the Suez remained both a prize and a powder keg. Imagine the scene one last time. British warships, once symbols of unstoppable empire, retreating in silence. French leaders, humiliated, facing the reality of decline. Israeli tanks, rolling back across the Sinai, forced to yield to international pressure. And Egyptian crowds, roaring with pride, as Nasser waved to them from a balcony in Cairo. This was not just the story of a canal. It was the story of a world in transition. The story of empires dying, nations rising, and superpowers watching closely from the shadows. The Suez Crisis was the end of one era, and the beginning of another. So, what do you think? Was the Suez Crisis truly a victory for Egypt, or just a temporary illusion of power? Did Eisenhower's decision save the Middle East from Soviet influence, or did it plant the seeds of future chaos? History is never simple, and the echoes of 1956 can still be felt today, in every crisis, every clash, and every struggle for control in the Middle East. If you found this story eye-opening, if you want to explore more hidden moments of world history, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next documentary. Because the past is not just behind us. It's alive. It's waiting. And it still shapes our world today.